It didn't begin with music. It didn't begin with applause. It began with a sound that didn't belong at any farewell. A man's breath, ragged, broken, like he had been running from something no one else could see. The funeral space hadn't even settled into silence yet when the doors shifted and every head turned at once. At first, people didn't recognize him, not because he'd changed his face, but because grief had stripped him down to something thinner than a person. A frail figure moved through the rows as if each step cost him a year of his life. And then, before anyone could speak his name, he collapsed beside the coffin. It was Aaron Sorkin, the student Rob cherished most, the voice the world knew for razor-sharp words, now reduced to a trembling body on the floor, shaking like a candle in wind. He hadn't arrived late because he didn't care. He arrived late because pain and illness had nearly broken him before he could say goodbye. His face looked hollowed out, exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days, like he'd been living in a room with no windows, surviving on nothing but regret, and the unbearable thought that he might never get one last chance to say thank you. His speech wasn't grand, it wasn't polished, it wasn't even steady. Every word he tried to form trembled and fractured under the weight of grief. And somehow that made it worse for everyone listening because it proved something terrifying. Even while facing the most fragile period of his health, he has still forced himself here for one reason only: to honor the teacher who had guided him through the most defining years of his life. Perhaps even after leaving this world, Rob Reiner received the most precious gift of all. Not awards, not headlines, but deep, sincere love from the lives he had touched. They came, they cried, they said, "Thank you." And one question lingered in the salt air like a whisper the ocean refused to carry away. And you, how will you remember Rob Reiner? On the morning of December 23rd, the dawn sunlight was still faint over a long stretch of sand by the sea. This wasn't a theater. This wasn't a red carpet church with cameras waiting outside. This was the place their parents had once longed to rest in peace. Rami and Jake Reiner stood side by side, hands tightly clasped, hearts heavy with a sorrow too large for language. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Their faces said everything. They had chosen a private, secluded section of the coastline in Los Angeles, a place untouched by intrusion. The guest list was the strict, only close family, a few lifelong friends who had shared Rob's political convictions and deep friendship, and several former colleagues who had stood beside them for many years. No crowds, no spectacle, just the sea, just the wind, just the truth of goodbye. This was the place where Rob and Michelle had once told their children that if one day they were to leave this world, they wanted to return to the ocean, where the waves beat steadily like breathing, where the wind carried memories and final peace. That choice, simple yet profound, became their last wish. And now their two children had to fulfill it. The coffin rested temporarily on the sand, surrounded by pure white bouquets, old photographs, and a few small candles flickering in the sea breeze. The waves murmured softly as if whispering alongside the family's grief, reminding them the world continues on even when your own world has ended. Romy choked back tears. Her voice trembled so hard it almost disappeared into the wind. "Mom, Dad, the ocean will keep all of your memories, but I still can't." Jake stood beside his sister. He'd bowed before their parents' coffin. His eyes were red, fixed on the distant line where the sea met the sky, and the sun was slowly rising like nothing had happened. He exhaled deeply as if trying to push the pain out through his lungs. "We'll try," he said, "but I don't know how we're supposed to go on." The sea wind tossed their hair and the scattered white petals across the sand, and for a second it felt cruel because that same wind also carried warmth, memories, echoes of laughter, of embraces and smiles that had once been so real they felt like they should still be standing right here. Shortly after Romy and Jake's phone calls the day before announcing the funeral, the people who had loved Rob Reiner began to arrive one by one, not as stars, but as humans who had lost someone they couldn't replace. Rita Wilson stepped onto the sand first, her eyes swollen with tears. The ocean air met her face and she didn't wipe it away. She let grief be seen. Her voice shook, but it was deeply heartfelt. "They lived and loved with everything they had," she said, swallowing hard. "I don't know what else to say except thank you for letting me know them." She moved closer as if her presence alone could wrap the grieving family in something warmer than the cold bite of reality. Not long after, Meg Ryan appeared. She bowed before the coffin and pressed her hand gently against the white flowers. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't need to. She whispered, almost like she was afraid the wind might steal the words before they reached him. "Oh, how deeply we will miss him." Then she'd stayed there, still and quiet, as if losing Rob meant losing a piece of her youth forever. Because in her mind, Rob didn't just make films. He made time feel alive. He made laughter feel safe. And now, see how quickly it all turns into memory. More figures were approaching in the distance, their silhouettes small against the brightening sky. Faces that had shared decades with Rob, people who had carried pieces of his life in their own, and somewhere behind them, still unseen, was the moment that would break everyone open completely, because Aaron Sorkin hadn't come to give a speech. He had come to confess a love he never said out loud while Rob could still hear it. Till, when Aaron Sorkin finally stood, the crowd didn't rush him. No one clapped, no one moved. They understood something fragile was unfolding in front of them. His hands trembled as he rested them against the edge of the coffin. For a moment, it looked like he might fall again. His body betrayed him, but his voice fought back. "I wasn't supposed to speak today," he said quietly. "I told myself I wouldn't, because if I started, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stop." He paused, swallowed hard. "But Rob never let me hide behind silence, so I won't today." He looked down, not at the coffin, but at his own reflection in the polished wood, as if he were staring at the younger version of himself, the one who didn't know how to survive this industry, the one who didn't know how to survive himself. "I didn't meet Rob Reiner when I was strong," Aaron continued. "I met him when I was angry, arrogant, afraid. I thought brilliance was enough. I thought talent could replace kindness." A faint, painful smile crossed his face. "Rob showed me how wrong I was." He told them how Rob never raised his voice, how he corrected with patience instead of humiliation, how he listened, really listened, even when everyone else in the room had already made up their minds. "He didn't just teach me how to write," Aaron said. "He taught me how to breathe when the world felt like it was closing in." There was a long silence after that, not an empty one, a heavy one, the kind that presses on your chest and reminds you that something permanent has just been lost. Aaron wiped his eyes with shaking fingers. "When I was at my worst, When I was making mistakes I didn't know how to undo. Rob never turned his back on me. He didn't excuse me. But he didn't abandon me either. His voice cracked. That's not something you forget. He stepped back slightly, as if the weight of those words had drained the last of his strength. And now, he whispered, I'm standing here, saying goodbye to the man who believed in me when I didn't deserve it. Somewhere behind him, Michelle's closest friend lowered her head and began to cry. Not softly, not politely. The kind of crying that comes from deep in the lungs when composure finally surrenders. Aaron took one last breath. If there's any justice in the universe, he said, then Rob already knows how much we loved him, because he spent his life teaching us how to love each other better. He touched the coffin once, gently, reverently, then he stepped away. And only then did people realize something devastating. This wasn't just a funeral, it was a room full of lives quietly confessing that they would never be the same without Rob Reiner, and that the man standing there, barely able to remain upright, had just lost not a mentor, but a compass. As Aaron returned to his seat, his shoulders shaking, the ocean wind surged stronger, carrying with it the sound of waves crashing harder than before, as if the sea itself understood what had just been said. And yet, this was only the beginning, because there was a story about Rob that very few people in that space truly understood. A side of him that had nothing to do with fame, nothing to do with success, and everything to do with sacrifice. A story that would change how everyone remembered him forever. After Aaron stepped away, the space fell into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. No coughing, no shifting feet, no whispers, only the ocean breathing in the distance. People thought they knew Rob. They thought they understood him through interviews, films, speeches, and headlines. But what came next wasn't about the Rob the world applauded. It was about the Rob no one ever wrote about. One of his oldest friends stepped forward, not a celebrity, not a director, just someone who had known him before the awards, before the power, before the industry hardened people's edges. He never wanted credit for this, the man said softly, and he would probably be angry with me right now. A few faint smiles appeared through tears, but the truth deserves to be told at least once. He spoke of nights Rob stayed up answering calls from young writers on the brink of quitting, of checks written quietly without signatures, of phone calls made behind closed doors to protect careers that weren't his to save. He didn't just open doors, the man continued. He stood in front of them when they were about to be slammed shut. There were stories of Rob turning down projects that paid well but felt wrong, of arguments with the studios when they tried to erase voices that made them uncomfortable, of moments when he chose loyalty over leverage. He paid for it, the man said, in ways no one ever saw. The crowd shifted, not restlessly, but uneasily, because success stories are easier to digest when they're clean. Sacrifice makes them complicated. Another voice followed, a woman who had worked with Rob decades ago. She remembered a time when the speaking up had consequences, especially if you weren't powerful. I was told I was difficult, she said, that I should be grateful just to be there. Her voice steadied. Rob didn't agree. She described how he stood between her and a room full of executives, how he didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply said no, calmly, firmly, without blinking. That moment changed my life, she said, and he never mentioned it again because that was Rob. He didn't collect gratitude. He didn't keep a score. He didn't turn kindness into currency. As these stories layered over one another, something shifted among the mourners. Grief turned into recognition, recognition into awe. They weren't just mourning a man, they were realizing how many lives had been quietly held together by his presence. Romy pressed her fingers into her palm, grounding herself as memory after memory reshaped her understanding of her own father. Jake stared at the sand, jaw tight, realizing that the man he called Dad had carried more weight than he ever let his children see. And then came the moment no one expected. Because just when the gathering thought they had reached the deepest truth, a letter was brought forward, unopened, unshared, written years ago. A letter Rob had never intended anyone to read aloud, and what it contained would leave the entire shoreline breathless. The envelope looked ordinary, off-white, slightly worn at the edges. Nothing about it suggested the weight it carried. Romy took it with both hands. For a moment, she didn't open it. She simply stared at her father's handwriting, as if the letters themselves might speak first. This was found in his desk, she said quietly. It wasn't addressed to anyone. There was no instruction, just words. Her voice trembled. I don't know if he wanted this read, but I think maybe he knew one day we'd need it. She unfolded the paper slowly. The sound alone felt too loud, and then she began. If you're reading this, the letter said, then I'm probably gone and you're probably hurting. A soft wave rolled in behind them, collapsing gently against the shore. I wish I could tell you that I figured everything out, that I learned how to be brave all the time. The truth is, I didn't. I was scared more often than I let on. People shifted. This wasn't the voice they expected. I worried about the people I loved. I worried about the choices I made. I worried that I wasn't doing enough. Romy paused, wiping her eyes. But if there's one thing I learned, the letter continued, it's that showing up matters more than being perfect. If you show up for people, even when you're tired, even when you're afraid, something good usually survives. Jake closed his eyes. His shoulders shook. I hope you forgive me for the times I failed, and I hope you remember me for the times I tried. There was a long pause before the final lines. Take care of each other. That's all I ever wanted. If you do that, then I'll be okay wherever I am. The letter ended there. No signature. No goodbye. Because Rob never liked endings. No one spoke. Even the ocean seemed to quiet itself. It was then that Aaron Sorkin stood again, slowly, carefully, as if his body were negotiating every movement. This, he said hoarsely, is why he mattered. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, everyone understood something devastatingly clear. Rob Reiner hadn't just built a career. He had built a shelter. And now the people inside it were learning how to stand without him. But the farewell wasn't over yet. Because the final ritual, the one Rob had chosen himself, was still waiting. The tide had shifted. The water crept closer now, gentle but relentless, as if time itself were reminding everyone that nothing waits forever. The sun had risen fully above the horizon, casting a soft gold across the sand. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. This was the moment Rob had chosen. No speeches, no applause, no cameras, just the ocean. Romy and Jake stood together, their hands gripping the edges of the urns. They had rehearsed this in their minds 1,000 times, and still, nothing prepared them for how heavy it felt. Not the weight in their arms, but the weight in their chests. This was his favorite sound, Romy whispered, listening to the waves. He said it reminded him that life keeps moving even when you don't want it to. Jake nodded, unable to speak. They stepped forward together. The first ashes touched the water and disappeared almost instantly, swallowed by the tide without resistance. No splash. No drama, just quiet acceptance, as if the ocean already knew them. Romy's breath caught. It feels wrong, she said softly, like we're letting him go too easily. Aaron, standing a few steps behind them, shook his head. No, he said. It feels wrong because he spent his whole life holding on to everyone else. They continued, slowly, carefully, until the urns were empty. The wind lifted fine gray traces into the air, carrying them outward, scattering them across the endless blue. In that moment, something subtle happened. People stopped crying, not because the pain was gone, but because it had changed shape. This wasn't an ending anymore. It was a return. Rita Wilson clasped her hands together and whispered, "Thank you," into the wind. Meg Ryan closed her eyes, smiling faintly through tears, as if replaying a private memory only she could see. And Aaron stood perfectly still. Later, someone would ask him why he hadn't said more. He would answer simply, because everything important had already been taught. As the group began to step back from the shoreline, Romy turned once more toward the sea. "Take care of him," she said quietly. The waves answered, steady and endless, but just when everyone thought the farewell was complete, one final truth remained unspoken. A truth about legacy, about influence, about how some people never really leave. Because Rob Reiner's story didn't end at the water's edge. It began again in every life he had changed. Weeks passed. The shoreline returned to normal. Footprints vanished. The candles burned out. The flowers were carried away by the tide or taken home by hands that still trembled when they touched them. And yet nothing truly ended, because grief doesn't disappear. It relocates. It showed up in empty chairs at dinner tables, in unanswered phone calls, in moments when someone reached for advice and remembered too late that the person who always picked up wasn't there anymore. But something else began to happen as well. Writers started telling us stories they had once been afraid to tell. Directors defended voices that were easier to silence. Young creators spoke up in rooms where fear used to win, and many of them didn't even realize why. They just knew that somewhere along the way, they had been taught not to run. Aaron Sorkin returned to work slowly, painfully. His health remained fragile, his energy inconsistent. But when someone asked him what kept him going, his answer was always the same. "Rob taught me that responsibility doesn't end when it hurts." Romy began organizing her father's notes, old journals, margins filled with thoughts never meant for publication. Some were funny, some were brutally honest. All of them carried the same quiet theme: care about people more than outcomes. Jake, on the other hand, avoided the boxes for months, until one night, unable to sleep, he opened one at random. Inside was a list, names, dozens of them, no explanation. When he asked his mother's old friend what it was, she looked at him gently and said, "Those are the people your father helped." Without telling anyone, Jake closed the box and didn't open another one that night. Because suddenly, the absence made sense. Rob had spent his life giving pieces of himself away. And now, the world felt lighter in some places and unbearably heavier in others. That's the thing about real influence. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It just changes the shape of things quietly, permanently. And that is why, even now, his name still surfaces in conversations where courage is required, in moments when someone chooses to stay instead of leave, to protect instead of profit, to listen instead of dominate, not because he asked for it, but because he lived it. In the end, Rob Reiner didn't leave behind a single monument. He left behind something far more difficult to measure, a standard. And for those who were lucky enough to learn it, that a standard became a promise. There was one truth no one admitted that day by the sea, not in speeches, not in letters, not even in silence, because it was too uncomfortable to say plainly. Rob Reiner wasn't just loved because he was kind, he was loved because he made people better and held them accountable when they weren't. Those who knew him well understood this part. He didn't flatter. He didn't rescue egos. He didn't confuse comfort with care. If you were wrong, he told you. If you were afraid, he stayed. If you were talented but cruel, he didn't excuse you. And that was why his absence felt so sharp. Because suddenly there was no one left in certain rooms who could speak truth without fear or agenda. No one who could say, we can do better, and have people actually listen. In the weeks after the funeral, people began to notice it. Meetings that drifted instead of grounded. Conversations that avoided hard truths. Decisions made for convenience rather than conscience. Someone finally said it out loud months later, in a quiet office after a long day. We need a Rob. The room went silent, because everyone knew what that meant. They didn't need another director. They didn't need another legend. They needed someone willing to lose power in order to protect people. And that's when the real legacy revealed itself. Rob had never tried to be irreplaceable. He had tried to teach others how to replace him, not by copying him, but by choosing the harder path when it mattered. Aaron once said privately to a friend, the worst part isn't that he's gone. It's that I still hear his voice. And now I have to answer it myself. That's how you know someone mattered. When even in their absence, they continue to demand honesty from you. When their memory doesn't soothe you, it challenges you. And maybe that was Rob's final lesson. That grief isn't meant to soften us. It's meant to sharpen us. So when people ask, years from now, who Rob Reiner really was, the answer won't be found in awards or credits or headlines. It will be found in moments when someone chooses courage over safety, truth over comfort, people over power. That is where he still lives. And if you're listening right now, maybe that's the real question. When it's your turn, will you choose the easy way or the right one?